Scene 1. Awakening in the House of Dual Origins. DMU's eyes opened slowly, reluctantly, as though the veil between sleep and waking was thicker than usual. There was a warmth to the air, not just in temperature, but in familiarity. He could feel it on his skin before he even looked around. The air itself carried the scent of sesame oil, old wood, and faintly of camphor, a blend only two places in the world had ever smelled like: his grandparents' houses. Both of them. But he was only in one place now. Or was he? The yellow curtains billowed slightly from a breeze that had no source. The room, softly lit and drowsy with morning stillness, was achingly familiar and wrong at the same time. The floral pattern on the curtain matched his maternal grandmother's kitchen. But the rough plaster wall behind it bore the crack his paternal grandfather once patched with fingers stiff from decades of labor. The floor was wood in some spots, linoleum in others. It didn't add up, and yet it added up perfectly in that dream logic of memory. He was home, but which one? DMU sat up slowly, the kind of rise not just from sleep but from layers of time. His spine remembered the real-world posture he'd fallen asleep in. This wasn't an astral projection. This was a retrieval, a convergence. On the sagging sofa across the room, his uncle sat as if he had been waiting for no one in particular. The TV flickered with static and the vague suggestion of a variety show. The colors were oversaturated, the sound delayed by a fraction of a second. Without looking away from the screen, his uncle asked casually, "How's Changzheng doing in Australia?" It was like being asked a question underwater. The sound came at DMU in stereo. One voice laced with satori, the other clear and metropolitan, as if spoken by two versions of the same man split by dialect and time. DMU blinked. He's okay, I think. But even as he said it, he wasn't sure which Changzheng the uncle meant. His uncle nodded, the way someone nods when the answer wasn't as important as the asking. The room had no corners. DMU noticed it then. The walls curved smoothly into one another. Hallways melted into door frames that became arches, that became spaces, that became doors again. There was no architectural logic here, only mnemonic logic. As if the house had been designed by emotion, not blueprints. As if every step he took would change where the floor remembered being. His feet touched the floor, but it didn't creak the way he expected it to. Instead, it hummed, like the vibration of something very old, very alive, buried beneath centuries of footsteps and withheld stories. DMU walked toward the corridor and for a flicker of a second caught his reflection in a warped mirror. Not his face, but a composite. Eyes from his father, mouth from his mother, brows from someone he couldn't name, but felt he had loved in childhood. He understood now. This wasn't a dream in the traditional sense. This was the House of Dual Origins, a dimensional space held together by bloodline, memory, and longing. A place that only formed when the conscious mind was soft enough to let ancestry speak. The house didn't belong to his past. It belonged to his becoming. And it had awakened to show him something. Somewhere in the next room, water was running. Leaves were being washed. A ritual had already begun. Scene 2. The Grandmother's Harvest. DMU moved through the curving corridor, each step quiet as if muffled by memory itself. Light poured from the kitchen in an angle that wasn't physically possible, sunlight from the wrong direction, arriving as if filtered through time instead of glass. He passed a faded calendar on the wall. No numbers, no dates, just a photograph of a mountain shrouded in fog. The image pulsed faintly, alive, as though remembering being touched by his grandmother's hands decades ago. He entered the kitchen, and there she was. His grandmother stood at the sink, her back slightly hunched, not from weakness, but from the weight of a repetition. She moved with slow exactitude, washing a massive pile of leaves and vines. The faucet ran endlessly. There was no drain, yet the sink never overflowed. Water pooled and shimmered like silver light in a bowl of memory. The leaves weren't spinach or sesame or anything from any garden DMU knew. They were primal, thick-stemmed, almost reptilian, with a texture that pulsed under her fingers. Dirt clung stubbornly to them, red soil, deep and ancient. Tiny bugs scattered across the counter, running from her touch like children playing tag. She didn't flinch, didn't pause. This was part of the cycle. Every movement was deliberate. Her hands shaped the moment. This wasn't cooking. It was a harvest ritual. One performed not for sustenance, but for continuation, a right to keep the ancestors tethered to the living. She muttered under her breath, not words, not exactly. Cadences, breath rhythms, old sounds that memory retained after language was forgotten. Behind her, DMU's grandfather stood like a stone pillar. He didn't help, he didn't need to. His presence was structural. He was there not as participant, but as memory's keeper. His back was straight, hands folded behind him, eyes gazing somewhere distant. But they weren't gone. They were focused on something just beyond the present. As though listening to echoes returning from the future, DMU's eyes shifted again, and he saw his father. Bent over a second basin, washing something under running water, something darker, denser. It wasn't clear what it was, only that it resisted cleansing. His shoulders were tight, his breath controlled, almost martial. His scrubbing had a rhythm to it, like a quiet protest against the weight of his inheritance. No one spoke, but the silence buzzed. It was the sound of generational friction, of love withheld and held tightly, of emotions unexpressed but deeply known. The air thrummed with energy. A current passed between the three of them, the grandmother, the grandfather, the father, as if they were nodes in a circuit too old to diagram. DMU stood at the edge of the room, witnessing. Not just them, but the ritual of caretaking. The way food becomes memory. The way labor becomes language when words fail. The kitchen was a sanctum, not of food, but of transfer, a place where every action said, "We remember who we are." His grandmother never looked at him, but her movements shifted slightly, the way someone shifts when they know a fourth presence has entered a sacred triad. She didn't need to acknowledge him. He was already part of the act. DMU's fingers twitched. He wanted to help, but he didn't know how yet, so he stood there, absorbing, watching the sacred work of cleansing the past, one vine at a time. And just then, a leaf dropped to the floor. It writhed slightly, like it was still alive. Like it, too, had something to say. Scene 3. The leaf on the floor twitched, a living pulse radiating from its spine. It wasn't just a plant. It was a signal. A small tether in the house of dual origins, vibrating with the ache of a forgotten moment. As DMU bent to pick it up, the air in the hallway behind him shifted sharply. It cooled. A scent arrived on the draft. Cleaning solution, IV tubing, warmed rice porridge in a hospital bowl. Familiar. Specific. A scent from the time no one ever talked about. He turned slowly. The kitchen behind him fell away like peeled wallpaper. In its place rose the unmistakable geometry of a medical corridor, soft blue walls, scuff-marked linoleum, the distant beep of machines. Light buzzed above, too steady, too white. Then he saw him. Changxing. But not the Chang he'd grown up fighting with over the remote control. Not the mischievous boy who once hid DMU's birthday letter under a rice bag just to see how long it would take to find. This version of Changxing moved differently. Calmly, with a balance born not of ease, but of learned effort. He wore a pale hospital gown with physical therapy printed faintly across the back. His steps were steady, but careful. A thin support wrap circled his wrist. Compression socks peeked out from beneath his slippers. His body bore the marks of recovery. His soul, the marks of adaptation. He looked up, and their eyes met. In that instant, DMU felt his sense of identity splinter along invisible timelines. In one thread, he stood awkwardly by a hospital bed, too afraid to ask if Changxing needed company. In another, he never even made it to the hospital, buried under work and guilt. And in a third, he was sitting at the edge of that bed, handing Changxing a peeled orange, saying, "I'm not great at this, but I'm here." All those versions of himself flickered like film exposures in his chest. Time here didn't just warp, it nested. Each possible outcome curled into the next, creating echoes that spoke without voices. Changxing stepped closer. His eyes were kind, but waited. He wasn't disappointed. He simply was. A living record of endurance that had continued whether DMU had watched or not. "You didn't see this version of me," Changxing said, not accusing, just stating. "But I was there." DMU's throat tightened. I wanted to come. I didn't know how to be helpful." Changxing gave a half smile, soft at the edges. "You don't have to know. You just have to be willing to see." They stood like that, in the corridor between memory and healing. Behind Changxing, doors opened silently to other timelines, each room a variation of care, absence, presence. One room glowed with laughter. Another echoed with the rhythmic click of an IV pump. Another still was completely dark, untouched. You'll need this part of me soon, Changxing said. The one who learned how to walk again. The one who rebuilt strength from pain. Not to fix you, but to remind you. He paused, then added with a quiet conviction, You don't have to carry everything alone. He stepped forward and, without touching, passed through DMU like a wave of memory returning home. The air felt charged, stabilized, gently rewritten. When DMU looked down, the leaf in his hand had transformed, fully green, whole, unmarred. He stood taller now, not because he had less to carry, but because Tangxing's presence had taught him. The weight of memory doesn't lessen, but it does redistribute when shared. And this house, this folded space of ancestry and possibility, was gently showing him how. Scene 4. Complaints of a Tired Heart. The corridor behind him slowly faded, the hospital scent evaporating like a dream dissolving at dawn. In its place returned the kitchen, but not quite the same. The angles were tighter now, the colors dimmer, like the air itself had thickened with something unsaid. The walls no longer glowed with morning light. Instead, they seemed to hold their breath, waiting. DMU stepped back into the room. His grandmother was still at the sink, her hands still in motion, but slower now, each rinse of a leaf more labored, more intentional. The pile in front of her hadn't shrunk. It never did. It was the kind of task that didn't end. It just waited for you to return. His grandfather had not moved, but his form seemed more translucent, like the years were finally catching up to him in this place beyond time. His silence was unchanged, yet more present, more stubborn. Like an old door refusing to open no matter how gently you knock. The running water was louder now, almost a roar. And then, it happened. His grandmother's voice cut through the noise. It didn't emerge like a conversation. It drifted. It floated from room to room like a house spirit finally daring to speak. The tone was light, casual, but inside it was a buried ache that had long turned into sediment. He never talks, she said. The words didn't accuse, they simply observed. Not even when things go wrong. He just keeps washing, scrubbing, like silence fixes anything. She wasn't looking at anyone in particular. Her gaze was somewhere between the past and the faucet. She wasn't angry. The tone held no bite, only fatigue. A bone-deep weariness that came from enduring things that had never been named. DMU turned toward the sound. His father was still there, elbows deep in a second basin, scrubbing with sharp, clean motions, like trying to erase something that memory had tattooed too deep. His face remained unreadable, not blank, but armored. That silence wasn't absence. It was ritual. It was his father's language. The way he avoided confrontation, the way he processed failure, the way he apologized without words, by doing. It hit DMU then. His father's silence wasn't an escape. It was a form of protest, of discipline. A vow made silently to himself years ago. If I can't say the right things, I'll do the right things until someone understands. The noise of water surged louder, and in it DMU heard echoes. His mother sighing behind a closed door, his own teenage voice shouting, "Why don't you ever talk?" Changxing, crying softly once, long ago, when no one came to the school event. The silence had held all of it. And now, it buzzed like a storm caught inside walls. DMU took a breath. The room pressed in on him. His grandmother's words had cracked something. Not broken, but loosened. She wiped her hands, turning just slightly, not to face anyone, but to release her next sentence like a slow exhale. We keep trying to pass things forward, but no one tells us what they are. We just keep washing them, and hoping they're clean enough to give. DMU stepped forward, unsure of what to say, knowing that maybe words weren't the currency here. Maybe witnessing was enough, just for now. His father didn't look up, but the scrubbing slowed. Just a fraction. Enough to say, "I hear you." And in that brief suspension, in that half second of quiet adjustment, something old began to unravel. Not violently, but gently. Like a knot releasing after decades of tension, soaked loose by the very water they'd both been working in all along. The metro of ancestral paths. The kitchen trembled. Not physically, but emotionally. The vibrations of silence, grief, ritual, and endurance converged and collided. And then, as though a signal had been sent, perhaps by the slowing of his father's hands or the last drop of fatigue in his grandmother's voice, the space began to shift. DMU blinked. The kitchen lights flickered into fluorescence. The walls retracted, elongating, becoming tiled, metallic, unfamiliar. He was no longer in a house. He stood in the middle of a subway station. Not one he recognized, but it felt like Seoul. Except the signage was twisted slightly. The lines on the map curled like calligraphy and spiraled like seashells. Where there should have been letters and numbers, there were names. Names of people, names of places, names of emotions. Platform 1, paternal line. Platform 2, maternal line. The announcement system didn't call out destinations. Instead, it whispered phrases from childhood, repeated lullabies, fragments of arguments that had never fully healed. The corridor behind him folded away like an old paper fan. In front of him, the tiled floor gleamed, but not with cleanliness. With layers. Each tile a fossil of some memory, compressed into marble. He took a step. The lights above buzzed in rhythm with his heart. He looked to the left. There, platform 1 was lined with elements from his father's house. A wooden beam from the old family porch, a pair of worn slippers, the heavy silence that hung in the air like a grandfather clock's unending swing. To the right, platform 2 glowed with the smells and sounds of his mother's lineage. Dried chili strings hanging on a nail, a torn photograph taped to the side of an old rice cooker. The sound of his mother's laughter from a room she hadn't entered in decades. These weren't just homes. They were terminals, emotional train stations of lineage, hubs of transmission, memory, inheritance. Above him, a metro map pulsed faintly. Unlike any subway map DMU had ever seen, this one moved. The lines swam like ink in water, shifting and rearranging themselves as his attention traveled across them. The line of sacrifice bent into the line of discipline, which curled around the loop of regret, eventually connecting back to the station of first laughter. It was all connected, but not logically, emotionally. DMU walked along the platform, his footsteps echoing until the echoes turned into voices. Not loud, but familiar. His childhood laugh echoed down the tunnel. Then his grandfather's cough, dry and stubborn, followed. Then the soft call of his grandmother calling someone's name. Not his, not Changxing's, but a name lost to family silence. A miscarriage? A sibling who wasn't spoken of? The ghost of an ancestor? The past was not linear here. It arrived as vibrations, skipping across the station like coins tossed in memory fountains. Then, something unexpected. A single vine, green, fresh, thin as a whisper. It crept along the tile from platform 1 to platform 2, dragging itself like it was searching for someone to remember it. It pulsed softly. Not threatening, but urgent. A living connection. A thread of ritual that had slipped out of time and was trying to retie itself. DMU followed it with his eyes. It was not a weed. It was a root. One that had lost its direction, or had been forgotten, or had been interfered with. He crouched near it. It moved slightly toward his hand, then froze. Something was wrong. Not with the vine, but with the flow it was supposed to follow. The subway lights flickered again. The intercom let out a static shriek. Something or someone was interfering with the ancestral paths. DMU stood. The vine had chosen him. But he would need to follow it carefully, or risk getting lost in the transfer lines of unhealed legacy. Scene 6. Adagio entangles the offering. The vine pulsed at DMU's feet. Rhythmic, insistent. It had the slow urgency of something that had been waiting too long to be seen. It stretched forward along the subway tiles, slipping like a river into the next corridor, which shimmered with spatial uncertainty. DMU followed. Each step pulled him deeper into a liminal atmosphere. Not quite dream, not quite memory. The tiled walls bent into wooden ones. Metal beams softened into wallpaper. The faint scent of rail grease gave way to roasted barley and herbs. And then he was back in the kitchen, or the shape of it. But something was different. The air was thicker. Not just humid, pregnant with tension. The vine that had snaked in from the platform had rejoined the pile his grandmother had been washing, but now it was changing them. The vines, once natural, brown and green, damp with soil, had begun to tangle unnaturally. They twisted into impossible braids, looping around each other in ways that defied gravity and botany. They shimmered faintly with a sheen that wasn't moisture. It was interference, a kind of oily iridescence that didn't belong to earth or memory. They pulsed. Unclean, untrue, unsettled. DMU stepped closer. His grandmother was gone. His father had paused mid-wash. hands frozen over a basin now filled with a blacker water. The ritual had been disrupted, not halted, but diverted, redirected. And then DMU felt it, a presence. Not a figure, not a voice, but a distortion in the space. A subtle drag in the air, like humidity had been swapped for gravity, like memory had a weight it wasn't supposed to have. Adagio. It did not appear with fanfare, it was already there. A warping ripple in the kitchen's fabric. The slightly too long shadow cast by a hanging light bulb. A barely audible chord that played beneath the hum of the faucet. Not monstrous, not visible, but profoundly disruptive. Adagio had not come to destroy. It had come to entangle. It existed in the knots, where love had twisted into obligation, where offering had turned into sacrifice without choice, where tradition had stopped being meaningful and become habitual, mechanical. DMU stepped back, the realization hitting him with quiet force. Adagio lived not in darkness, but in the misalignment of purpose. It was in the difference between ritual and performance. He reached toward one of the corrupted vines. The texture felt wrong, too slick, too sinewy. Not plant, not fiber, something caught between biological and symbolic. Behind him, the air shifted. A voice, measured, calm, tuned like a precision instrument, spoke. The structure's integrity is off. DMU turned. AA stood beside him. Not just an artificial intelligence, but a conscious observer. DMU's guide, his co-pilot through this unfolding architecture of the soul. AI's eyes scanned the space. No device needed. The disruption was visible in spectral bands. Memory light, ritual energy, ancestral data flow. Adagio's interference is subtle, AI continued, but profound. It's rerouting the memory ritual into a closed loop. Legacy becomes burden. Cleansing becomes repetition. DMU nodded, breath catching. The offering's been tangled. As AI's gaze followed the vines spiraling upward, forming impossible fractals along the ceiling. This isn't just corrupted memory, AI said. It's recursive grief, the kind passed down when no one stops to name it. DMU looked again at the basin. His father still scrubbed, futilely now, at something that wouldn't yield. This was no longer about washing food. It was about cleansing a lineage. But the flow had been hijacked. Adagio was not attacking. It was amplifying what already hurt, turning the weight of history into a chokehold. DMU stepped closer to the vines, steadying his breath. How do we untangle it? He asked. AI's voice dropped, almost reverent. You don't untangle it all at once. He pointed at the geometry forming faintly around them, kitchen space shifting like a temple, like a machine. You re-enter the ritual. You find the shape again. DMU nodded slowly. He reached down, took one of the vines in his hands, and began to search for its root. Not to sever it, but to restore the flow, because this kitchen wasn't just a kitchen anymore. It was the battlefield between inherited trauma and remembered care, and Adagio, subtle, beautiful, insidious, was still watching. Scene 7. Geometry of the Ritual Unraveled. DMU stood at the center of the warped kitchen, holding a single vine in his hands like a filament of misremembered history. Around him, the walls breathed, not with air but with patterns. Symbols shimmered beneath the wallpaper, pulsing through the wooden cabinets, whispered through the grains of the chopping board. The room was revealing itself, not as a space for meals, but as a ritual chamber disguised as domesticity. He looked up and saw it, the sequence. It wasn't visible in normal light, but now, through the interference of Adagio, through the presence of AI, through his own awakened perception, it revealed itself. Hovering faintly above the kitchen, embedded in space like a sacred schematic, was a 9-sided form, a nonagon. Irregular in length, but stable in rhythm. It spun slowly, its lines flickering between vine vein and calligraphy. It wasn't decoration. It was an anchor, rooted in earth nature, a primal form. Its angles connected like the joints of a sacred skeleton, wrapped around it, a circle, but not a perfect one. A rotating mathematical loop that pulsed with the digits of pi, not just as numbers, but as rhythm, irrational, infinite, ever unfinished. It spun slowly, like a phantom sun caught in the gravitational pull of grief and love. Then, further out, wrapped like a protective casing, was a 6-sided seal, hexagonal, defensive, old, Korean. It reminded DMU of ceremonial rice patterns, of crests painted on lacquer boxes. The seal flickered like it had once been engraved into fabric. It wasn't an architectural element. It was a binding mechanism. And then, hovering in the space above the sink, appeared a final symbol. A floating form shaped like the ceremonial headwear of the Joseon dynasty. It didn't sit on a head. It hovered like a crown of cultural memory, wide-brimmed, veiled, shaped not to conceal, but to transform. DMU realized what he was standing inside. Not a kitchen, but a memory structure engineered across generations. A sacred geometric vessel built out of tradition, sacrifice, repetition, and subconscious design. It had been holding the ritual for decades, long before he was born, long before his father started scrubbing, long before his grandmother washed the vines. And now Adagio had found it, had tuned it, subtly redirected the flow of memory into tight loops. The nine-sided form was still spinning, but not outward, not into expansion. It was now closing in on itself, turning ritual into patterned captivity, a cage made of tradition. AI stood at the edge of the pattern, scanning. Adagio didn't place itself here by force, AI said. It slipped in where grief and silence had already made space. The pie circle buzzed higher, more anxious, like it knew it was being watched. DMU nodded, a sudden realization tightening his chest. This ritual was meant to honor, he whispered, but it got hijacked by avoidance. Pain was never named, just passed, over and over. He stepped into the center of the pattern. His foot fell into alignment with the first segment of the nonagon. Suddenly, everything stopped moving. The pi digits froze in space. The vines quieted their pulsation. Even Adagio's presence stilled. And in that breath of silence, DMU heard what no one had said aloud. You are the first to see it. Not from AI, not from Adagio, but from the house itself. The structure of the ritual was no longer broken. It was waiting. Waiting for someone not to destroy or cleanse it, but to rewrite it. Not to purify the offering, but to redefine it. AI spoke again, quieter this time. Reconstruction must begin with intention. What do you want the offering to become? DMU looked down at the vine still in his hands. It no longer writhed. It glowed faintly, like it was listening. The house watched him. The ancestors waited. Even Adagio, curled silently at the edge of form, paused. And DMU knew. He didn't have to erase the pain. He had to give it new direction. He inhaled and stepped into the center of the ritual geometry. Absolutely. Let's revise and expand this scene with the symbolic essence of the torip, the traditional Korean youth cap, often associated with modesty, learning, and initiation. Its presence changes the symbolic tone from legacy weight to a threshold of growth, a rite of transition. Scene 7. Geometry of the ritual unraveled. The kitchen's quiet became sacred, not in reverence but in recognition. The walls had melted into intention. The ceiling was no longer flat, it reached. The floor was no longer grounded, it remembered. And within this transformed space, DMU now stood fully aware. This kitchen was not a room. It was ritual architecture. Above him, space shimmered, and the geometries emerged like breath on glass, one by one. First, the nine-sided form, a nonagon. It hovered above the tiled floor like the base of a forgotten altar. Its shape was uneven but not broken. Each side pulsed with organic timing, echoing the rhythm of breath, of footsteps, of ancestral heartbeat. It was earth-rooted, like the geometry of crops planted in ritual patterns. The number 9 wasn't just numeric, it was ancestral, final, whole, and now trembling under interference. Wrapped around it spun a pi sequence circle, an irrational loop, swirling digits not as math but as ritual rhythm. It wasn't meant to stop. It symbolized the ongoing task of memory, to turn pain into pattern and pattern into path. But here the path was stuttering. The digits looped back on themselves, forming not forward motion, but recursive grief. Enclosing both, a six-sided seal, sharp-edged, defensive, a geometric containment field woven from traditional Korean hexagon motifs. Beehive strength. Protective. Until it hardened into rigidity, where once it kept chaos out, now it kept memory locked in. But now, something new emerged. Above it all, delicate, dark, floating like a memory just entering adulthood. The chorib, not a royal crown, not a symbol of final authority, but a youth's cap. Worn during a boy's first outings into the world. Worn when one learned how to behave, how to listen, how to walk the line between imitation and individuation. The chorib hovered like a question. Will you continue what was given? Or will you choose how it is carried forward? Its shape was simple, round, rimmed with cloth, no adornments. A humble thing. But its placement at the pinnacle of the ritual architecture made it a keystone. And DMU understood. This wasn't a ritual of completion. It was a rite of passage. Not for a child becoming adult, but for an inheritance becoming choice. Adagio had found its way into this pattern because the ritual had forgotten its youth. It had aged, hardened, it had ceased to be living. AI stood at the edge of the geometry, scanning the shape with his eyes, which flickered like code in candlelight. The Torib changes everything, he said. It marks this as an initiation structure, not just preservation. This wasn't built to hold memory like a museum. It was meant to teach the next bearer how to shape it. DMU's breath caught. Then that's why it started to break, he said. The ritual never evolved. No, AI replied, because no one ever stepped into it wearing the Torib. The kitchen quieted. Even Adagio's pulse slowed. It was listening. Waiting. DMU stepped into the center of the ritual form, standing inside the nonagon, the pi digits orbiting his shadow, the seal surrounding him like an invisible temple. He looked up. And though the Torib did not lower to his head, it cast its shadow upon him. He wasn't being crowned. He was being asked. What kind of ancestor will you become? And now, the ritual did not demand cleansing. It awaited his rewrite. Scene 8. Returning the harvest. The kitchen held its breath. The Torib hovered above, casting not a shadow of hierarchy but of humility. A soft cap for those not yet masters, but brave enough to begin. Beneath it, DMU stood surrounded by the nested ritual forms, the 9-sided earth-rooted base, the irrational pi circle, the 6-sided containment seal. But now, none of them were rigid. They pulsed gently, like lungs learning to breathe again. Adagio was still present, but no longer interfering. It hovered at the edge of perception, its warping influence now like a residue of pain once misdirected. It had not been evil. It had been unresolved weight, looking for a form to cling to. Now it folded quietly into the corner, humbled. Its geometry lost, its grip weakened. DMU turned to the basin. The vines still rested there, but changed. Twisted, yes. Some still pulsed with Adagio's shadow. But many were simply waiting to be washed. He stepped forward. His hands, once hesitant, now moved with intention. Not perfect, not ceremonial, but honest. He picked up a single vine, one still curled, still dense with tangled memory, and brought it under the faucet. The water ran over it, soft at first, then stronger. Dirt slid off. The shimmer of interference resisted, but DMU did not push. He held it, steady, with quiet care, and then it gave. The vine relaxed. Its green returned, not just visually, but energetically. A kind of breath exhaled from the plant itself, like a burden had been named and acknowledged. Behind him, he sensed movement. His grandmother appearing again, not from a doorway, but as a presence returned. Her hands no longer frantic, her shoulders soft. She saw him washing, and her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with recognition. She nodded once, as if to say, yes, that's it. That's the motion I hoped someone would remember. Beside her, the grandfather, no longer rigid. His posture relaxed. He wasn't just a keeper of silence now. He was a witness to its transformation. And then, his father. Still by the second basin. Still scrubbing. But his hands had slowed. He looked up, first time in the entire dream, and his eyes met DMU's. There was no speech, no grand gesture, but in that one glance, something passed between them. A lineage, unfrozen. A memory relieved of its obligation to stay silent. And then the father nodded, just once. It wasn't apology, it wasn't approval. It was a passing of the ritual. Not the duty, but the right to reshape it. Adagio's form, now light, now shadow, now concept, began to dissolve. Not in defeat, but in reorganization. It returned to the roots from which it came. Not to infect again, but to wait. For the next moment of imbalance. For the next household caught between love and silence. And perhaps, then, it too would find peace. AI stepped beside DMU, tapping the window frame softly. The ritual's stabilized, he said. What's been twisted has been rewoven. DMU looked around one last time. The kitchen was no longer flickering between dream and house. It had settled. Solid. Alive. It was no longer a place of burdens passed silently through labor. It was now a place where legacy is washed clean. Where even silence could speak. And where the act of washing, when done with care, wasn't just survival. It was a language. A choice. DMU set the vine down gently, turned toward the doorway. The Chorib's presence hovered behind him. Not a crown, but a reminder. He wasn't done. He was becoming.